Welcome into the place where terror lies. Subscribe now and step into the darkness, if you dare. I found a hidden door in my basement. It started off like any other night. My parents had left for the weekend, leaving me alone in the house. I used to like being on my own, and in all honesty, I welcomed the quiet. At 18, I should have been looking forward to freedom, but deep down, something about the house unsettled me. It wasn't that anything was particularly wrong, not at first. But the longer I stayed in this house, the more I felt something lurking just beneath the surface. Something that I couldn't explain. The basement, for instance, had always made me feel uneasy. It was just a basement, dark, musty, filled with old furniture and boxes of junk. The kind of place that no one ever really bothered to go unless they had to. It was cold in the basement, not just chilly, but cold in the way that gets under your skin. Like the air itself is alive and watching you. And I would go down there, of course. Everyone did. But every time I walked down those stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was this feeling that gnawed at me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it every time. This night started out like any other. I was doing what I always did when I had the house to myself, walking the dark halls in silence, my mind lost in thought. It's something I do often, pacing back and forth, letting my mind wander, needing that rhythmic motion to keep me grounded. It's a habit, one that I don't even realize that I'm doing until it's too late. I can spend hours walking through the house, my footsteps echoing softly, the darkness wrapping around me like a blanket. Sometimes I'll talk to myself just to hear my own voice in the quiet. But tonight was different. I had just taken a break from my usual pacing, standing in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom. The air felt heavier tonight, thick with something that I couldn't quite place. I had the strangest sensation that something was watching me. But when I glanced around, there was nothing. The house was still, the silence suffocating. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, just staring at the closed door, my hand resting lightly on the doorknob. My mind drifted, as it often did when I was alone, a mix of curiosity and creeping unease rising within me. The basement door, the one I had passed by hundreds of times without a second thought, suddenly seemed different. It caught my attention, and that's when I noticed something strange. Something was wrong. A door that I'd never seen before was particularly hidden behind a tall shelf. It was faint, barely noticeable, almost as if it had been purposefully hidden from view. The faint outline of the door was masked by shadows, so much so that I thought I was imagining it. But the longer I looked, the more I realized it was real. My heart began to pound. I could feel my pulse quicken in my throat. I had been in this house for years, and I had never seen this door. Curiosity tugged at me, like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to go closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward it. The wood of the door was rough and splintered, covered in grime, as though it had never been touched in years. The air around it felt colder, unnatural, and I shivered. Not just from the temperature, but the overwhelming sensation that something was wrong. It was like I had discovered something that was never meant to be found. I reached out with my trembling hands, my fingers just brushing against the cold surface of the door. It was almost as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. The door handle was old, rusted, and stubborn, but after a few tries, I managed to twist it open with a reluctant, creaking groan. The sound reverberated in the still air, like a distant scream echoing through an empty room. And then, the darkness beyond the door swallowed me whole. I hesitated for a moment, standing in the doorway, my flashlight shaking in my hands as I looked into the abyss. The air inside the room smelled damp, like mildew and decaying wood. It was so cold, I could feel it seeping into my bones. But what struck me the most was the silence. It was so absolute, so oppressive, that it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me. I stepped inside. The moment that my foot crossed the threshold, I felt a shift. The weight in the air increased. The walls seemed to close in around me as if the room were alive and slowly tightening its grip. The floor creaked beneath my weight, each step echoing through suffocating silence. I couldn't see much at first. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the blackness, illuminating only a small patch of the floor ahead of me. The room was narrow, maybe only 10 feet long. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that looked decades old, and the floor was covered in layers of dust, as if no one had stepped foot in there in ages. The only thing that caught my attention was the mirror. I stood at the far end of the room, positioned awkwardly against the wall. The mirror was large, too large for a space this small, and the frame was made of a dark, rotting wood that had long ago lost its polish. The glass was cracked, the fissures spreading out like veins across the surface, distorting the reflection behind it. But even in that distorted reflection, I could make out the faint outline of something. Someone. I froze. The figure in the mirror was a woman, but not like any woman I had ever seen. She was tall, gaunt, with long tangled hair that obscured most of her face. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so. And her eyes. Her eyes were wide, too wide, as if they were trying to crawl out of her skull. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but the sound didn't reach me. The reflection was twisted, like the woman wasn't quite right. Her body seemed to shift unnaturally with every subtle movement, her form warping in and out of focus as if she didn't belong in this reality at all. I tried to turn away, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as though the woman in the mirror was reaching out to me, pulling me closer with her empty gaze. I could feel it in my chest, a tugging sensation, like something was drawing me to her, making it harder and harder to resist. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the reflection was closer, much closer. The woman's hand pressed against the glass, her fingers long and twisted, as though they had grown long from disuse. I could see the blood-red streaks on her fingertips, dark and smeared like they had been scraping at that mirror for years. Her smile, if you could call it that, was wide and unnervingly wide, stretching far beyond what a face should be capable of. Her fingers twitched, and then she moved. She didn't just shift within the reflection. No, she moved, stepped closer to the glass as though she was preparing to crawl through. I could feel her presence closing in, an oppressive weight against my chest, making it harder to breathe. The glass creaked, groaned, as though it was struggling to hold her back. And I, in that moment, knew, without a shadow of doubt, she wanted out. I stumbled backward, tripping over a forgotten box behind me, my breath coming in panicked gasps. My flashlight flickered, casing erotic shadows across the room. And when I looked back up, the woman was gone. But the room was different now. The air was colder, impossibly so. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It had become something else, something far more real. I turned to run, but the door, the one that I had come through, was no longer there. The walls had closed in, sealing me inside this cursed, suffocating place. I slammed my hands against the wood, desperate to break free, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows around me deepened and the temperature plummeted, freezing my skin as I realized something horrific. I wasn't alone anymore. Behind me, I could hear the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps. The woman was there. She had found me. And I could feel her fingers, cold and damp, brushing against the back of my neck. I ran. I don't remember how I escaped, but somehow I did. My mind blocked it out. The door reappeared, the light returned. I raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I am never going back down there. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear her. I hear her whisper from the darkness, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Thanks for joining me on this spine-chilling journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a new tale of terror. Do you have a scary story idea you'd like to see come to life? Or maybe you've experienced something equally as terrifying in real life? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it and maybe even turn it into my next video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones waiting to be told. See you soon.